Welcome, and thank you for watching the 2020 RFP 2021 Housing Tax Credit Multifamily Scoring Training. This tutorial provides in-depth guidance for completing the self-scoring worksheet. It can be viewed in its entirety or by sections, which are broken out for easy reference. For those applicants who are new to Minnesota housing, the agency provides access to safe, decent, and affordable housing and builds stronger communities across the state. It offers products that support the development and preservation of affordable rental housing through both financing and long-term asset management. It has also pioneered a successful model for supportive housing that helps stabilize the lives of some of the state's most vulnerable citizens. Additionally, Minnesota Housing offers products and services to help Minnesotans buy and fix up their homes and stabilize neighborhoods, communities, and families. This tutorial will cover minimum thresholds, Minnesota Housing strategic priorities, and selection categories and criteria. Technical assistance provided by Minnesota Housing staff is only advisory and does not guarantee that a development will receive points under a particular category or be selected for funding. While every effort is made to ensure the accuracy of the technical assistance, such assistance is subject to and does not modify or override the requirements of Minnesota Housing's Qualified Allocation Plan, Housing Tax Credit Program Procedural Manual, the Housing Tax Credit Self-Scoring Worksheet, and/or the Request for Proposals Deferred Loan Priority Checklist, the Multifamily Request for Proposals Guide, Multifamily Underwriting Standards, or other documents related to applications for funding. Applicants are encouraged to review the materials available on the Minnesota Housing website and consult with legal counsel, and if applicable, a knowledgeable tax professional to ensure compliance with all applicable application, submission, and project requirements. Scoring is an integral part of the RFP application process and is one of several ways that Minnesota Housing selects projects for funding. Some basic scoring information includes: tax credit projects must meet a minimum point requirement to move forward in the RFP process. For 9% tax credit projects, the minimum point requirement is 70. For deferred with 4% tax credit projects, the minimum requirement is 40 points. It is important for applicants to know that these point thresholds represent the minimum points needed. In reality, competitive projects score much higher. In the 2019 RFP 2020 tax credit funding round, the final point range for 9% tax credit projects in Greater Minnesota was 117 to 110 points. In the metro area, the final point range was 115 to 103 points. Minnesota Housing will only award points if they were claimed by applicants and they meet the supporting documentation requirements outlined in the self-scoring worksheet and the deferred scoring guide. Minnesota Housing will reduce points if the documentation does not meet requirements. There are two key documents that applicants will need: the Multifamily 2021 HTC Self-Scoring Worksheet that includes the 2020 Deferred Loan Priority Checklist and the 2021 HTC and 2020 Deferred Scoring Guide. The documents are linked on this slide, but they can also be found on Minnesota Housing's website at www.mnhousing.gov. Click Apply for Funding under Multifamily Rental Partners that can be found on the right side of the page. On the Apply for Funding tab, click Tax Credits and scroll down to the applicable documents. Note that the 2021 HTC Self-Scoring Worksheet and 2020 Deferred Loan Priority Checklist, which is a single Excel document, is linked on the website as the 2021 HTC Self-Scoring Worksheet. The document itself includes the full title. Also note that both documents will be referred to throughout this tutorial as a self-scoring worksheet and the scoring guide, respectively. The self-scoring worksheet and deferred loan priority checklist is an Excel document that applicants must complete and submit with applications. Applicants will select various versions of the Excel document depending on the type of financing being sought for a particular project. For example, if projects are structured as a 9% tax credit only proposal, applicants would select the 9% housing tax credits only request box. The minimum thresholds, strategic priorities, and all scoring criteria are listed on the worksheet. The self-scoring worksheet is the source document that Minnesota Housing uses to score applications. So keep in mind that Minnesota Housing cannot award points if they are not claimed on the self-scoring worksheet. Remember to carefully review the final version prior to submission to verify accuracy. Some other important notes to keep in mind. Applicants must have at least one strategic priority selected in order to enter scoring criteria information. If applicants uncheck a funding type selection after beginning to enter data into the self-scoring worksheet, the score sheet will not retain the data that was entered. The scoring guide is the companion document to the self-scoring worksheet. Much of the supporting documentation is listed in the self-scoring worksheet, but the scoring guide contains more detail and clarifications. In some instances, helpful tools and templates are linked in the scoring guide. This training will review these helpful tools and templates. It is important to reference both documents to make sure applications are competitive and are eligible to receive the points being claimed. This section outlines the minimum threshold requirements for tax credit projects. All 9% applicants in Round 1 must meet a minimum threshold. There are 5 threshold categories available to applicants: projects in the metropolitan area, projects outside of the metropolitan area, supportive housing for people with disabilities, preservation, and rural development. Projects can meet more than one threshold. For example, a preservation project might also meet the metropolitan area threshold. For projects in the metropolitan area, or metro, applicants have 3 minimum threshold options. Projects can meet more than one. First, new construction or substantial rehabilitation in the metro, in which at least 75% of the total tax credit units are single-room occupancy, efficiency, or one-bedroom units with rents affordable to households whose income does not exceed 30% of the area median income, AMI, would meet a minimum threshold. Second, new construction or substantial rehabilitation family housing projects in the metro that are not restricted to persons 55 years old or older, in which at least 75% of the total tax credit units contain 2 or more bedrooms, and at least 1/3 of the 75% contain 3 or more bedrooms, would meet a minimum threshold. The third option is only available for substantial rehabilitation projects in neighborhoods targeted by the city for revitalization. For scattered site projects, this threshold applies to the whole project. At least 51% of the total units must meet the threshold. Outside the metropolitan area, projects must meet a locally identified housing need and be in short supply in the local housing market, as evidenced by credible data submitted with the application. Credible documentation could include a market study that meets Minnesota Housing's market study guidelines, a housing study done in the applicable jurisdiction, a local council resolution, or a threshold letter from an authorized city representative identifying the locally identified housing need that the project meets. A link to a sample HTC threshold letter can be found on page 5 of the scoring guide. For scattered site projects, at least 51% of the total units must meet the threshold. Option 3 is a minimum threshold for projects that are not restricted to people of a particular age group, and in which a percentage of the units are set aside and rented to people with a serious and persistent mental illness as defined in Minnesota statutes, section 245.462, subdivision 20, paragraph C, with a developmental disability as defined in United States Code, Title 42, section 6001, paragraph 5, as amended, who have been assessed as drug-dependent persons as defined in Minnesota statutes, section 254A.02, subdivision 5, and are receiving or will receive care and treatment services provided by an approved treatment program, as defined in Minnesota statutes, section 254A.02, subdivision 2, with a brain injury as defined in Minnesota statutes, section 256B.093, subdivision 4, paragraph A, or with a permanent physical disability or disabilities that substantially limit major life activities, if at least 50% of the units in the project are accessible as provided under Minnesota Rules, Chapter 1341. Minnesota Housing considers accessible units to be Type A and/or Type B units, as identified in the referenced Minnesota Administrative Rules, Chapter 1341. This definition is not limited to persons with mobility impairment. For supportive housing for people with disabilities projects, at least 51% of the total units must meet the threshold. The remaining two thresholds include projects that preserve existing subsidized housing and rural development or RD projects. To meet the preservation threshold, projects, whether or not restricted to people of a particular age group, must demonstrate in their application that the use of tax credits is necessary to prevent conversion to market rate use, or to remedy physical deterioration of projects, which would result in loss of existing federal subsidies. The RD threshold is for projects financed by rural development, which meet statewide distribution goals. For both thresholds, scattered site projects must have at least 51% of the units meeting the threshold. This section outlines strategic priorities required for all projects. All applicants must meet at least one strategic priority. There are 9 priorities, and applicants are able to select more than one. Access to fixed transit, Greater Minnesota workforce housing, economic integration, tribal, community development initiative, preservation, supportive housing, tax-exempt bond allocation, and minimum point requirement. The tax-exempt bond allocation and minimum point requirement priorities are new for the 2020 RFP 2021 tax credit funding round. The first strategic priority is access to fixed transit and is for projects within 1/2 mile of a planned or existing light rail transit, bus rapid transit, or commuter rail station. For this strategic priority, applicants must select and demonstrate eligibility for selection criteria 3D1AI to meet this threshold. The slide indicates what this selection criterion looks like on the self-scoring worksheet. For scattered site projects, at least 51% of the total units must meet the threshold. The second strategic priority is Greater Minnesota workforce housing. Projects must provide supporting documentation that demonstrates both need and employer support. Need is defined as projects in communities with low vacancy, typically considered 4% and below, documented by a market study or other third-party data, and that can demonstrate at least one of the following. The community has experienced net job growth of 100 or more jobs. The community has 15% or more of the workforce commuting 30 or more miles to work. Or the community has planned job expansion documented by a local employer. The second requirement to meet this priority is to demonstrate employer support. This can be done with a letter of support from an employer with 20 or more full-time employees. For scattered site projects, at least 51% of the total units must meet the threshold. The third strategic priority is economic integration and is for projects located in higher income communities in the Twin Cities 7-county metropolitan area and areas in or around Duluth, Rochester, and St. Cloud, with access to low and moderate wage jobs meeting either first or second-tier economic integration, as defined in the increasing geographic choice category. This means that applicants must select and demonstrate eligibility for either selection criteria 3A 1B(I), first tier, or selection criteria 3A 1B(II), second tier, to meet this threshold. The slide indicates what this selection criterion looks like on the self-scoring worksheet. The geographic location will be verified by Minnesota Housing staff, which means applicants do not need to submit supporting documentation. For scattered site projects, at least 51% of the total units must meet the threshold. The fourth strategic priority is tribal and is for projects sponsored by tribal governments, tribal designated housing entities, or tribal corporate entities. To meet this threshold, applicants must either list the tribal government, the tribally designated housing entity, or the tribal corporate entity as the owner-sponsor on the Development Team tab in the Multifamily Workbook, which will be submitted with the application, or provide an organizational chart of the proposed ownership entity describing the tribe's participation and percentage of ownership. The fifth strategic priority is the Community Development Initiative and is for projects that contribute to active implementation of a community development initiative as defined in the Community Development Initiative Selection Criterion to address locally identified needs and priorities in which local stakeholders are actively engaged. Applicants must select and be eligible for selection criteria 4A1 to meet this priority, including submitting a completed Community Development Initiative narrative. This slide indicates what the criterion looks like. More information will be provided on this criterion later in the training. The sixth strategic priority is preservation, which is for projects that preserve existing federally assisted housing or other critical affordable housing. Applicants must meet one of the following preservation selection criteria thresholds: risk of loss due to market conversion, risk of loss due to critical physical needs, or risk of loss due to ownership capacity program commitment. Additionally, applicants must be eligible for one of the following preservation selection criteria to meet this threshold: existing federal assistance, Tier 1, project-based rental assistance operating subsidies, existing federal assistance, Tier 2, or critical affordable units at risk of loss. For scattered site projects, at least 51% of the total units must meet the threshold. The seventh strategic priority is supportive housing, which is for projects that will serve people with disabilities or high-priority homeless households. Projects must be eligible under one of the following selection criteria: 1B, permanent supportive housing for high-priority homeless, HPH, or 1C, people with disabilities, PWD. The slide indicates what the selection criterion looks like on the self-scoring worksheet. The eighth strategic priority, and the first of two new strategic priorities for this funding round, is the tax-exempt bond allocation priority. As required by Minnesota Statute, Section 462A.222, Subdivision 3D, residential rental housing projects financed with an allocation of tax-exempt bonds under Chapter 474A are the highest strategic priority, and such developments are therefore not required to meet a separate strategic priority. This priority will be listed as Strategic Priority H on the self-scoring worksheet. The final strategic priority and second of the two new priorities is the minimum point requirement priority. A request for Minnesota Housing Administered tax credits from the state's tax credit volume cap need not meet a separate strategic priority if projects demonstrate they are eligible for not fewer than 70 points, excluding projects funded through the Rural Development Small Projects Set-Aside, which only require a minimum of 30 points. Keep in mind that applicants must claim and be determined eligible by Minnesota Housing to receive at least 70 points to meet this priority. Along with the tax-exempt bond allocation priority, this priority will also be listed as Strategic Priority H on the self-scoring worksheet. This section will cover selection categories and scoring criteria individually. There are 8 selection categories that establish the scoring framework. The categories are: greatest needs tenant targeting, serves lowest income for long durations, increasing geographic choice, supporting community and economic development, preservation, efficient use of scarce resources, building characteristics, and unacceptable practices. Each category is broken down into various scoring criteria that equate to points. The first selection category is greatest need tenant targeting. The scoring criteria in this category are large family housing, permanent supportive housing for high priority homeless, and supportive housing, people with disabilities. The first scoring criterion in the greatest need tenant targeting selection category is large family housing. Large family housing is for proposals for projects that provide family housing that is not restricted to persons 55 years old or older. In selecting this criterion, applicants agree to market to families with minor children. In the metro, at least 75% of the total assisted units contain 2 or more bedrooms. For Greater Minnesota proposals eligible under 1A, at least 1/3 of the 75% contain 3 or more bedrooms. The unit calculation is based on a calculation using the number of assisted units. An assisted unit is defined as tax credit units for tax credit applications and affordable units for deferred funding. Minnesota Housing will validate the number of units entered in the self-scoring worksheet with the number of units indicated on the unit rent grid on the Housing Income tab of the project's workbook. Simply round up to the nearest whole unit. The second scoring criterion in the greatest need tenant targeting selection category is permanent supportive housing for high priority homeless, or HPH. To be eligible for HPH points, a minimum of 5% of the total units, but no fewer than 4 units, must be set aside and rented to households prioritized for permanent supportive housing by the Coordinated Entry System. Applicants can receive additional Continuum of Care points if projects prioritize the local need identified by the Local Continuum of Care, or COC. Note that applicants can see COC priorities listed for a project's county by reviewing the Continuum of Care priorities methodology. Minnesota Housing will validate all information with the submitted multifamily workbook. The HPH units must be marked as HPH units on the rent and income grid in the workbook, and the type of rental subsidy must be indicated. If no subsidy is available, rent levels must be underwritten to the supportive housing units underwriting standards outlined in the multifamily underwriting standards, and they must be financially feasible. Projects must round up to the nearest unit. HPH units cannot overlap with people with disabilities units, which will be reviewed next. Note that rural development, RD projects, may be prohibited from selecting particular rent and income restrictions and/or tenant household types. Consult with RD and Minnesota Housing staff with questions related to this. Also note that the self-scoring worksheet outlines several threshold requirements that must be met in order to be eligible for points. The third scoring criterion in the greatest need tenant targeting category is people with disabilities, or PWD. To be eligible for this category, projects must have a minimum of 4 units. Projects can claim up to 25% or no fewer than 6 of the total units. The proposal must not be restricted to persons of a particular age group. A percentage of the units are set aside and rented to persons with any of the following disabilities: a serious and persistent mental illness as defined in Minnesota statutes, section 245.462, subdivision 20, paragraph C; a developmental disability as defined in United States Code, Title 42, section 6001, paragraph 5, as amended; assessed as drug dependent as defined in Minnesota statute, section 254A.02, subdivision 5, and are receiving or will receive care and treatment services provided by an approved treatment program as defined in Minnesota statute, section 254A.02, subdivision 2; a brain injury as defined in Minnesota statute, section 256B.093, subdivision 4, paragraph A; or permanent physical disabilities that substantially limit major life activities, if at least 50% of the units in projects are accessible as provided under Minnesota Rules, Chapter 1341. If applicants elect to set aside units to persons with a physical disability, keep the following in mind. The category is not limited to a mobility impairment, and the election triggers the requirement that at least 50% of the total units are accessible per Minnesota Accessibility Code, Type A or B. Minnesota Housing considers accessible units to be Type A and/or Type B units, as identified in the referenced Chapter 1341, also known as the Minnesota Accessibility Code. Minnesota Housing will validate the number of PWD units and all other information with the submitted multifamily workbook. The units must be marked as PWD on the rent and income grid in the workbook. The income limit should be restricted to 30% MTSP, and the type of rental subsidy must be indicated. If no subsidy is available, rent levels must be underwritten to the supportive housing units underwriting standards outlined in the multifamily underwriting standards, and they must be financially feasible. Rural development, RD projects, may be prohibited from selecting particular rent and income restrictions and/or tenant household types. Consult with RD and Minnesota Housing staff with questions related to this. PWD units cannot overlap with HPH units discussed previously. Keep in mind that this category does not permit age restrictions, so senior projects are ineligible for PWD points. Also note that the self-scoring worksheet outlines several threshold requirements that must be met in order to be eligible for points. The second selection category is serves lowest income for long durations. The scoring criteria in this category are serves lowest income tenants, rent reduction, rental assistance, and long-term affordability. The first scoring criterion in the serves lowest income for long duration selection category is serves lowest income tenants rent reduction. Eligibility is based on gross rent level, including utilities before rental assistance. Eligible units must have rents affordable to households whose incomes do not exceed 50% MTSP income limit without rental assistance. MTSP rent limits are available on Minnesota Housing's website. The rent restriction will be required throughout the term of the LURA. Minnesota Housing will validate the units against the workbook. Applicants seeking these points should reflect the rents for these units at or below the 50% MTSP rent limit in the rent and income grid of the multifamily workbook. Incomes do not need to be restricted to 50% MTSP rent limits. Projects must round up to the nearest unit and must be financially feasible. The calculation is based on the total number of units in the project. Serves lowest income points cannot be claimed on units that have rental assistance. For example, a 40-unit project with 40 rental assistance vouchers cannot claim points in this category. As another example, a 40-unit project with 10 rental assistance vouchers would not be eligible for option A, 100% of the restricted unit rents affordable to households with incomes at the county 50% HUD MTSP income limit. In projects with income averaging, any units at or below the 50% MTSP limit without rental assistance will count. The second scoring criterion in the serves lowest income for long duration selection category is rental assistance. Applicants will receive priority if a fully executed binding commitment for project-based rental assistance is submitted with the application. A binding commitment could include a binding resolution, binding letter of approval from a governing body. For the purpose of this category, project-based rental assistance is defined as a project-specific funding stream that supports the operations of the property, reduces the tenant rent burden, and provides for the tenant-paid portion of rent to be no greater than 30% of household income. Tenant-based rental assistance is not eligible. Units with rental assistance must be counted in this category. The unit cannot be counted toward the serves lowest income category discussed previously. For example, a 40-unit project with 40 rental assistance vouchers cannot claim points in the serves lowest income category. Units taken for points under rental assistance cannot be duplicated under preservation if projects are eligible for preservation points under existing rental assistance. Projects eligible for rental assistance points can claim additional points for agreeing to further restrict rental assistance to households whose incomes do not exceed 30% of the MTSP income limit for 10 years. The documentation must state that the deeper restriction is allowable. Minnesota Housing will validate the number of rental assistance units with the workbook. The units must be marked as rental assistance on the rent and income grid in the workbook, and the type of rental subsidy must be indicated. Provide a fully executed binding commitment. Again, commitments must be fully binding. A commitment can be contingent on receiving an award from Minnesota Housing. A commitment cannot be subject to a third-party RFP to award vouchers. Minnesota Housing, at its sole discretion, will consider rental assistance programs with alternative rent structures as proposed by the applicant, where households may pay more than 30% of their household income when the program goals align with the needs of low-income populations, such as with the moving to work and site-based housing support programs. For all other types of rental assistance programs with an alternative rent structure, the applicant must submit commitment documentation that includes details regarding the rent structure, the tenant-paid portion of household income, the program structure, goals, and the population served. Minnesota Housing, at its sole discretion, will also consider other programs such as those created by project sponsors or developers. Submitting appropriate documentation for such programs will also be required. Projects eligible for rental assistance points can claim additional points for agreeing to further restrict rental assistance to households whose incomes do not exceed 30% of the MTSP income limit for 10 years. The documentation must state that the deeper restriction is allowable. The third scoring criterion in the CERV's lowest income for long duration selection category is long-term affordability. It is only applicable for tax credit projects. Selection of this will be part of Exhibit D to the 42M Preliminary Determination Letter, Reservation, Carryover, and LURA. No supporting documentation is required at the time of application. The third selection category is increasing geographic choice. There are 4 scoring categories: economic integration, access to higher performing schools, workforce housing communities, and location efficiency. The first scoring criterion under the Areas of Opportunity selection category is economic integration. There are 3 options under this criterion. The first option is for mixed income projects in which no more than 80% of units will qualify as low-income units. Minnesota Housing will validate the units against the workbook. The second option is for projects located in first-tier census tracts. The third option is for projects located in second-tier census tracts. Economic integration applies to census tracts in the Twin Cities 7-county metro area, along with tracts in Duluth, St. Cloud, and Rochester. Included within community profiles are census tracts within the Twin Cities, Duluth, St. Cloud, and Rochester that meet the first and second tier points in the qualified allocation plan. Areas not eligible for economic integration points may be eligible under the Rural Tribal Designated Areas. For scattered site projects claiming points under Option 1A, each building must meet the criteria or must have 51% of the total units to qualify. For scattered site projects claiming points under Option 1B, at least 51% of the total units must qualify, and then use a weighted average to determine eligibility. As with higher performing schools and workforce housing communities, to determine if projects are eligible under 1B, economic integration, applicants can use the Community Profiles tool located on Minnesota Housing's website. The Community Profiles tool provides Minnesota Housing staff and partners a comprehensive tool to assist in the planning and funding process for affordable housing. Applicants do not need to provide maps or any other supporting documentation for this category. The second scoring criterion under the Areas of Opportunity selection category is access to higher performing schools. This criterion is for projects that will serve families in locations that will provide access to higher performing schools. At least 25% of the assisted units, with a minimum of 15 units, must have 2 or more bedrooms. Minnesota Housing will validate the units in the workbook. Eligible census tracts are in the Twin Cities 7-county metro area, along with tracts in Duluth, St. Cloud, and Rochester. Included within community profiles are census tracts within the Twin Cities, Duluth, St. Cloud, and Rochester. If an area meets or exceeds 2 of 3 performance thresholds for schools, it is considered to have access to higher performing schools. The performance metrics used are 3rd grade reading proficiency, 8th grade math proficiency, and on-time graduation rate. Scattered site projects must have at least 51% of the total units to qualify, and then use a weighted average to determine eligibility. As with economic integration in workforce housing communities, to determine if projects are eligible, applicants can use the Community Profiles tool located on Minnesota Housing's website at www.mnhousing.gov. The Community Profiles tool provides Minnesota Housing staff and partners a comprehensive tool to assist in the planning and funding process for affordable housing. Applicants do not need to provide maps or any other supporting documentation for this category. The third scoring criterion under the Areas of Opportunity selection category is workforce housing communities. There are 3 options under this criterion: Top Job Center or Job Growth Community, Individual Employer Growth, and Long Commute Community. For 1B, individual employer growth, applicants must submit documentation to demonstrate that an individual employer has added at least 100 net jobs. For 1C, long commute communities, applicants may be able to demonstrate why projects should be eligible despite not being represented in the community profiles. Applicants should work with their assigned underwriter prior to submitting an application in these instances. Scattered site projects must have at least 51% of the total units to qualify, and then use a weighted average to determine eligibility. As with economic integration in high-performing schools, to determine if projects are eligible for 1A or 1C, applicants can use the Community Profiles tool located on Minnesota Housing's website at www.mnhousing.gov. The Community Profiles tool provides Minnesota Housing staff and partners a comprehensive tool to assist in the planning and funding process for affordable housing. The third scoring criterion under the Areas of Opportunity Selection category is workforce housing communities. This category has two key components: access to fixed transit and walkability. Applicants claim eligibility based on how projects fit into three geographic categories: metropolitan area, Greater Minnesota urbanized areas, and Greater Minnesota rural and small urban areas. Scattered site projects should use a weighted average for eligibility based upon the total number of units that meet each category. For projects in the metropolitan area, applicants can claim access to fixed transit eligibility under one of 5 options. Projects within 1/2 mile of a planned or existing light rail transit, bus rapid transit, or commuter rail station can claim 7 points and can also claim eligibility under the Access to Fixed Transit Strategic Priority. Applicants can use the Community Profiles tool to determine eligibility for the project. Applicants can also claim walkability points. Walk scores can be accessed at www.walkscore.com. If applicants would like to request revisions of a location's walk score, contact WalkScore directly at mhfa-request@walkscore.com. WalkScore staff will review the request and make necessary adjustments to scoring within 45 business days. If an address cannot be found in the WalkScore tool, use the closest intersection within 1/4 mile of the proposed location. For more information, contact Cody Thurnau at kody.thurnau@state.mn.us. For projects in Greater Minnesota urbanized areas, applicants can claim access to fixed transit eligibility under one of 3 options. Applicants can use the Community Profiles tool to determine eligibility for the project. Applicants can claim walkability points in this geography as well. Walk scores can be accessed at www.walkscore.com. If applicants would like to request revisions of a location's walk score, contact WalkScore directly at mhfa-request@walkscore.com. For more information on adjusting walk scores, contact Cody Thurnau at kody.thurnau@state.mn.us. Lastly, for projects in Greater Minnesota rural and small urban areas, applicants can claim access to fixed transit eligibility under one of 3 options. Note that the supporting documentation for demand response or dial-a-ride must meet the minimum requirements. For example, a dial-a-ride brochure that states that same-day service is available would meet the eligibility requirements. Documentation that states prior day notice is preferred would not be eligible for the 7-point tier. Documentation that is vague or unclear may only be eligible for the 2-point tier. Applicants should work with their assigned underwriter with documentation questions. Applicants can claim walkability points in this geography as well. Walk scores can be accessed at www.walkscore.com. If applicants would like to request revisions of a location's walk score, contact WalkScore directly at mhfa-request@walkscore.com. For more information on adjusting walk scores, contact Cody Thurnau at kody.thurnau@state.mn.us. The 4th selection category is supporting community and economic development. There are 5 scoring categories: Community Development Initiative, Eventual Tenant Ownership, sometimes referred to as ETO, Rural Tribal, QCT, or Qualified Census Tract, Community Revitalization in Tribal Areas, and MIBI-WIBI, which stands for Minority and Women-Owned Business Enterprises. The first scoring criterion under the Supporting Community and Economic Development Initiative selection category is the Community Development Initiative. To be eligible for this criterion, projects must be a targeted geographic area, and applicants must submit a map of the area. Applicants need to submit a copy of the initiative or plan. Note that affordable housing needs to be listed as a key strategy of the plan. Applicants also need to submit a stakeholder list that identifies the roles of stakeholders. Additionally, applicants in a Qualified Census Tract, or QCT, must provide additional documentation demonstrating commitments of public or private investment in non-housing infrastructure, amenities, or services. Applicants must also outline the current implementation plan and identify completed, underway, or planned milestones. For scattered site projects, projects must have at least 51% of the total units to qualify, and then use a weighted average to determine eligibility. To demonstrate how projects are eligible for points, applicants must complete the Community Development Initiative narrative. This can be found on page 11 of the scoring guide. The next few slides provide more detail. The first eligibility requirement is to identify the targeted geographic area. The area must be larger than the project site itself and small enough that a city or county can have jurisdiction over the targeted area. Describe the targeted geographic area in question number 2 of the Community Development Initiative narrative. Applicants must include the initiative or plan page numbers that specifically reference and define that area. If the initiative or plan does not include a map itself, use a third-party mapping tool to map the boundaries of the targeted area as defined by the initiative or plan, and submit it with the other required supporting documentation. The second eligibility requirement is to identify the current implementation plan for the plan or initiative. The timeline must be current and active, and identify milestones or steps that are completed, underway, or planned. Applicants must describe the current timeline in question number 4 of the Community Development Initiative narrative. The initiative or plan page numbers that specifically reference timeline and completed, underway, or planned steps must be included. If the initiative or plan does not include a timeline, applicants may provide supplemental documentation such as a plan update or a letter from the plan owner, and submit it with other required supporting documentation. The third eligibility requirement is to identify how affordable housing is a key strategy of the initiative or plan. Applicants must describe the objectives of the plan, how projects relate to the overall plan, and where in the plan affordable housing is listed. Applicants demonstrate this in question number 1 of the Community Development Initiative narrative. Applicants must include the initiative or plan page numbers that specifically reference affordable housing. The fourth eligibility requirement is to identify the stakeholders involved in the development, management, and/or implementation of the initiative or plan. Applicants must describe the stakeholders and their roles in question number 3 of the Community Development Initiative narrative. Applicants must include the initiative or plan page numbers that specifically reference the stakeholders and their roles. If the initiative or plan does not include a list, applicants may provide supplemental documentation such as a plan update or a letter from the plan owner and submit it with the other required supporting documentation. Projects that are in Qualified Census Tracts, or QCTs, must also demonstrate how the initiative or plan includes other public or private investment that is non-housing. This investment could be commercial development, economic development, or transit development. The self-scoring worksheet provides other non-housing examples. Applicants must describe the non-housing investment in question number 5 of the Community Development Initiative narrative. Applicants must include the initiative or plan page numbers that specifically reference the investment. Successful completion of documenting the project's eligibility for points in this scoring criterion is required to claim points in the QCT Community Revitalization and Tribal Equivalent Area Selection Criterion that will be discussed shortly. Eligible initiatives or plans could include neighborhood plans, county plans, or comprehensive plans. Comprehensive plans will not count on their own. Applicants must submit an acceptable Community Development Initiative narrative as a supplement, including all updates and supporting documentation described on the previous slides. Housing and market studies are not eligible. The second scoring criterion under the Supporting Community and Economic Development Initiative selection category is Eventual Tenant Ownership, also referred to as ETO. This category is only available for tax credit projects. Applicants must meet the requirements listed in the Eventual Tenant Ownership Guide, found on the tax credit page of Minnesota Housing's website and on page 12 of the scoring guide. For scattered site projects, projects must have at least 51% of the total units to qualify, and then use a weighted average to determine eligibility. The third scoring criterion under the Supporting Community and Economic Development Initiative selection category is Rural Tribal. Project eligibility is based on a Qualified Allocation Plan, or QAP, methodology that lists eligible census tracts. No supporting documentation is required. For scattered site projects, projects must have at least 51% of the total units to qualify, and then use a weighted average to determine eligibility. The fourth scoring criterion under the Supporting Community and Economic Development Initiative selection category is QCT, Community Revitalization in Tribal Equivalent Areas. Projects must be located in a QCP, Community Revitalization Area or Tribal Equivalent Area. The self-scoring worksheet and the scoring guide have links to the methodologies that list which areas are eligible. Projects must be eligible for the Community Development Initiative points to be eligible for points here. For scattered site projects, projects must have at least 51% of the total units to qualify, and then use a weighted average to determine eligibility. The fifth scoring criterion under the Supporting Community and Economic Development Initiative selection category is Minority-Owned, Women-Owned Business Enterprises, or MIBI-WIBI. To be eligible, one or more of the following must be at least 51% minority or women-owned. Sponsor, executive director of a nonprofit, general contractor, architect, and/or management agent. Supporting documentation is required and could include a signed certification statement, qualification forms, or ownership documents. An entity managed by a minority or a woman is not enough for points with the exception of a nonprofit, which can use their executive director to qualify. Board composition does not count, and the executive director of a government entity does not count. Preservation is the fifth selection category. Applicants must meet one of three threshold options and one of three scoring criteria. Projects must meet one of three risk of loss thresholds. The first is market conversion. Applicants must demonstrate the project's ability to convert to market rate within 5 years of the application. The second is critical physical needs, where a third party assesses the repair and replacement of major physical components. The third is owner capacity, where a decline in owner's capacity or commitment to ongoing assistance must be evidenced. To meet the threshold for scattered site projects, the building or buildings that satisfy the threshold must have at least 51% of total units in order to meet the preservation threshold. For critical affordable units at risk of loss, use a weighted average to determine eligibility. Projects must meet one of three risk of loss thresholds. Existing federal assistance, Tier 1, project-based rental assistance operating subsidies. This tier is for projects receiving project-based rental assistance or operating subsidies under the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, the U.S. Department of Agriculture Rural Development, RD, the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act, also known as NAHASDA, or other program that is not scheduled to sunset or expire. Existing federal assistance, Tier 2. This tier is for federally assisted projects with a current recorded deed restriction, limiting rent or income restrictions at or below the greater of 80% of statewide median income or area median income, And finally, critical affordable units at risk of loss. This criterion is for projects with a current recorded deed restriction limiting rent or income restrictions at or below the greater of 80% of statewide median income or area median income under another non-federal program, including state, local, or intermediary funds. Refer to the self-scoring worksheet and scoring guide for more detailed information and requirements. The sixth selection category is efficient use of scarce resources and leverage. There are 4 scoring criterion: financial readiness to proceed, leveraged funds, other contributions, intermediary costs, and cost containment. The first scoring criterion under the efficient use of scarce resources and leverage selection category is financial readiness to proceed, leveraged funds. The intent of this criterion is to give applicants credit for secured funding commitments for permanent capital funding sources. All secured funding commitments for capital funding must be counted under this criterion. They cannot be counted under the other contributions criterion that will be described later. This can be calculated by dividing total secured funding by the total development cost. The calculation excludes first mortgage financing net of any tax increment financing. Minnesota Housing has created a scoring calculation worksheet for applicants. This is a helpful tool that can be used to determine the percentage for the calculation and what the respective points are. This tool is linked on page 15 of the scoring guide. Applicants are encouraged to use the tool and submit the completed version in the multifamily customer portal to assist Minnesota Housing staff when scoring. This slide provides an example of a completed tool. The level of funding secured is up at the top, which would correspond to a percentage range for points on the self-scoring worksheet. Minnesota Housing will validate the information with the project workbook. Minnesota Housing will also validate the information with the supporting documentation submitted with the application. Supporting documentation must be signed and must state the dollar amount. Note that for tax increment financing or TIF, applicants must provide satisfactory documentation that the contribution is committed to the development at the time of application. The documentation must include a City Council resolution indicating its intention to provide TIF assistance. The anticipated amount must be included in the resolution or a letter from the city. Minnesota Housing has created TIF resolution and TIF letter templates for applicants. They are linked on page 15 of the scoring guide. If there are deviations between the workbook and the supporting documentation, Minnesota Housing will defer to the source documentation. The self-scoring worksheet and the scoring guide contain detailed information and examples of acceptable documentation and sources examples. Pay close attention to these documents when obtaining commitments. The second scoring criterion under the efficient use of scarce resources and leverage selection category is other contributions. The intent of this criterion is to give applicants credit for non-capital sources that reduce development costs and are not reflected on the Sources tab of the workbook. Examples included waivers of fees, land donations, or any other contributions that reduce the overall cost of the project. All non-capital sources must be counted in this calculation, and applicants cannot count them in the financial readiness to proceed leveraged funds calculation described earlier. Minnesota Housing will validate the information with the supporting documentation submitted with the application. Supporting documentation must be signed and must state the dollar amount. In-kind donations must have supporting documentation to demonstrate the value. Note that for tax increment financing, or TIF, applicants must provide satisfactory documentation that the contribution is committed to the development at the time of application. The documentation must include a City Council resolution indicating its intention to provide TIF assistance. The anticipated amount must be included in the resolution or a letter from the city. Minnesota Housing has created TIF resolution and TIF letter templates for applicants. They are linked on page 15 of the scoring guide under the Financial Readiness to Proceed Leveraged Funds section. The self-scoring worksheet and the scoring guide contain detailed information and examples of acceptable documentation and sources examples. Pay close attention to these documents when obtaining commitments. Also note that the calculation for this category differs from the financial readiness to proceed leverage funds calculation. Unlike the financial readiness to proceed leverage funds calculation, there are no exclusions when calculating the other contributions percentage. The third scoring criterion under the efficient use of scarce resources in leverage selection category is intermediary costs. Generally, intermediary costs are soft costs associated with third-party services related to project development. For example, architect fees, engineering fees, appraisal fees, fees for a historic consultant, etc. The costs are listed on the Development Cost tab of the workbook. The Development Cost tab has a column with checkboxes that applicants can check, uncheck, which generates the total intermediary cost information at the bottom of the page. Most costs are hard-coded in to be pre-checked. Projects receive more points for negotiating lower costs. Certain fees are excluded from intermediary costs. The self-scoring worksheet and the scoring guide contain detailed examples of excluded costs. Pay close attention to these documents when obtaining commitments. Large amounts of exclusions should be backed up by supporting documentation submitted with the application. Just like the other contributions calculation, there are no exclusions in the intermediary costs application. The fourth and final scoring criterion under the efficient use of scarce resources in leverage selection category is cost containment. For cost containment, points are awarded to 50% of developments with the lowest cost within the following groups: new construction, Metro and Greater Minnesota; rehabilitation, Metro and Greater Minnesota. Points are available for 9%, 4%, and deferred projects. The thresholds are based on the applications that are received in the current funding round. Applicants can reference the 2019 cost containment thresholds to get an idea of whether their project costs seem in line with the prior year's thresholds. Refer to the cost containment methodology for more information. This is linked on page 16 of the scoring guide. The seventh selection category is building characteristics. There are three scoring criterion: universal design, smoke-free buildings, and Minnesota overlay to the Enterprise Green Communities criteria. The first selection criterion under the building characteristics selection category is universal design. Applicants agree that a certain percentage of units will meet universal design requirements based on the building type: 100% for elevator buildings and 10% for non-elevator buildings. Universal design includes minimum and optional features. For scattered site or multiple buildings projects, projects with both building types must meet both definitions in order to be eligible. For example, the elevator building would need to meet the elevator building threshold, and the non-elevator building would need to meet the non-elevator building threshold. Applicants do not need to provide supporting documentation. This is certification that the minimum requirements will be reflected in the architectural documents. The second selection criterion under the building characteristics selection category is smoke-free buildings. Applicants must provide a written smoke-free policy as supporting documentation. A lease addendum is satisfactory. For rehabilitation projects, the policy must also include procedures for transitioning to a smoke-free building for existing residents. The third and last selection criterion under the building characteristics selection category is Minnesota overlay to the Enterprise Green Communities criteria. Applicants are required to comply with the mandatory criteria on all projects. Applicants may elect to receive additional points for doing 2 to 3 times more than the mandatory minimum requirement. Applicants must include any additional criteria on the multifamily intended methods worksheet to be eligible for points. The eighth and final selection category is unacceptable practices. This category only applies to tax credit projects and may only apply to specific tax credit types, for example, 9% projects or 4% projects. Minnesota Housing will impose penalty points on projects where warranted. Thank you for watching this tutorial. For questions, contact your assigned underwriter. If you do not have an assigned underwriter, email technicalassistance.mhfa@state.mn.us. Include RFP scoring question in the subject line.